As a real estate professional, you will be involved in the sale of property and possibly helping sellers reach a decision on listing price. In nearly all cases, you will depend largely on comparative sales in the area to reach a consensus on the home's value. However, before a buyer can obtain financing, a professional appraiser will be required. In effect, the purpose of an appraisal is to determine the value of a property at a fixed point in time. Introduction to value. While most items we purchase have a limited life and are used nearly immediately, our home values are realized over time. To properly value a piece of property, all appropriate elements must be taken into consideration. The elements of the value of real estate are generally known as the acronym DUST. The acronym means demand, utility, scarcity, and transferability. Here's how they play a role in the value of a piece of property. Demand. As with any commodity, the more popular something is, the more people who are interested in buying. This results in an increase in value. If fewer people are interested, the demand is lower, and the value, therefore, is also lower. Utility. One tends to not think about the utility of a property because of the subjectivity of utility. However, the more useful the property, the higher the value. To put this into perspective, think about the features that would be helpful in a senior housing development. Features like handicap bars in the bathroom would be an example of something of value to seniors, but less attractive to someone in their 20s. Scarcity. If 10 people are trying to find a 3-bedroom home and there are only 5 available in the neighborhood they are interested in, the property has a higher value. If there are 5 people looking for a 3-bedroom home and there are 10 in the neighborhood, the property will have a lower value. Transferability. Most real estate professionals are familiar with clean, clear title. This means the property can be transferred to another person without restriction. This means properties that have an encumbrance, such as a right-of-way, will typically be valued lower than one with no encumbrance. Types of property value. Properties are valued in differing manners depending on the party who is requesting the value. Investors, insurance companies, mortgage companies, and taxing authorities all use different values for the same property, which can be confusing. Here are the various types of property value. Investment value. Investors are going to take a look at a variety of factors, including available financing and terms, as well as the tax rate of a property. Different investors may have different criteria when determining value. Insured value. Insurance companies will assess the parts of a home that may be destroyed to determine how much insurance coverage a homeowner may need. The value of the land a property sits on is therefore deducted from the overall value of the home. Value in use. Typically used for commercial properties, this valuation is determined by the current use of the property. For example, a single-site retail facility currently operated as a pharmacy may not convert well to a single-site restaurant. Therefore, the empty facility would be less valuable to a restaurant investor than to another retail investor. Assessed value. This value is assigned by municipalities for the purpose of determining the tax rate for a property. Mortgage value. This figure is determined by the amount of the mortgage of the property. This value changes in the event a property owner takes out a new mortgage. However, the mortgage value is not impacted if the property increases or decreases in value. Market value of real estate. The market value of a property is based on what the property, in the condition it currently exists in, will sell within a reasonable period of time. In a stable real estate market, this usually means what the property could sell for within a 30 to 90-day period. Keep in mind, the market value takes various issues into consideration, including that both the buyer and seller understand the transaction, that the sale is not based on coercion by one party or the other, and that the transaction is arm's length, meaning there are no related parties involved in the purchase and sale. Understanding true market value. To expand further on market value, one must understand there are several factors that must be taken into consideration. Some of them include equal motivation. Both the seller and the buyer must be equally motivated. This means neither party is under duress. An example of this would be if the seller is going through a divorce and is being forced to sell the home. They may be willing to accept a lower price for the home than it might be otherwise worth. Parties' best interests. While the interests of the buyer and seller may be different, both parties must be well informed about the risks and rewards associated with the pending agreement. For example, if a buyer sees a home they like and the home's roof is 20 years old, the buyer must be informed about this. When the final decision is made as to whether to move forward with a purchase and sale, both parties must be taking their own interests into consideration. Exposure on open market. The market for the property must be considered open. This has two factors: time and exposure. First, there must be a reasonable time the property is listed for sale. Second, the property must have exposure to the open market. One could not post a property for sale on a supermarket bulletin board for 3 weeks and assume that will ensure the proper level of exposure, nor that access to the open market was achieved. Consideration. The buyer must be willing to pay for the property in cash or the equivalent of cash. This will typically involve the buyer making a cash down payment and securing reasonable financing in return for the purchase of the property. Basically, the buyer is not trying to exchange the home for something of lesser value. For example, one would not expect the seller to accept a rake in return for a home. Future considerations. The buyer must be able to secure financing to facilitate the purchase. If banks have frozen lending to all single-family homes with fewer than 5 bedrooms, then the market value would be negatively impacted on homes with fewer than 5 bedrooms. Pricing of property sold. The price must be considered normal consideration for similar properties. In other words, if the seller was to make concessions, like agreeing to pay the buyer's mortgage for the first year in the home, this would fail the normal consideration test. Market value versus sales price. While most people believe that market value is tied to sales price, this is not always the case. A seller may believe a property is worth $200,000, but may not find buyers willing to pay more than $175,000. Therefore, the market value is not driving the sales price. Instead, the perceived value to a buyer is driving the sale price. When there are more buyers in a market, the value of a property increases. This is due entirely to demand. Remember, demand for properties are often cyclical. Parents with children in school are less likely to be looking for new homes between Halloween and New Year, meaning there is less demand for properties during this time. However, come May or June, parents who are considering a new home will be flooding the market, making demand much higher. Market value versus cost versus price. While one may believe the price of the home, cost of the home, and market value of the home will all be similar, this is not always the case. In fact, these values are all likely to be different based on various market conditions. Let's take a look at the difference between each. Market value. As previously stated, market value is based on numerous factors, including the condition a property is in at the time it is listed for sale. There is an assumption when a property sells in 90 days or less, without repairs, then the value of the property is the sale price. There are certain assumptions that are made with market value, including the knowledge of both buyer and seller. Both must have an understanding of the transaction they are entering into, and both must be negotiating in good faith. Cost. Cost may or may not equal value. There are numerous factors which go into the cost of a home, beginning with the land costs. Costs include all money that is spent in developing a property. This means the cost for an architect to design the property, legal services, and fees for filing the appropriate titles and deeds, as well as legal services. There are other fees, including the costs of a contractor, the taxes paid on the property, financing costs, materials for the property, and labor costs. Any cost that is associated with the purchase, development, ownership, or financing will be taken into consideration. Price. The bottom line in all real estate transactions is what the purchaser agrees to pay and what the seller agrees to accept. The price also takes other factors into consideration, including whether or not the transaction is conducted in an arm's length transaction. If two family members are involved in a purchase, the chance is that the sales price will be lower compared to a transaction where the persons are not related. An example of how these varying factors may be different can be seen in this type of scenario. Let us assume for a moment that a developer's goal is to build a house and sell the house to make a profit. This means the builder would need to factor in all costs, such as land acquisition, legal fees, financing fees, construction fees, etc. Once the builder has completed the construction, they now have the final cost. Therefore, based on their costs, they add on their projected profit, review the market, and make an analysis of what the property should sell for. In other words, the developer will list the property for sale at a specific price based on what they spent, what they want for a profit, and what they estimate the market will bear. Let's assume that after a sufficient period of time where the developer listed the property for sale, the best offer is $50,000 below the price they wanted. This decrease is often due to different factors and market conditions. Some of the market conditions that have impacted the seller negatively include increases in interest rates, less demand for property of that size or type, or other factors outside of their control. This may have a negative impact on the seller, but is typically good news for buyers. Buyer and seller relationships. While the end goal is to complete a purchase or sale, the buyer and seller are often working at odds with each other. This is because their interests are not the same. The buyer is interested in getting the home they want at the best price possible, while the seller is interested in making as much profit as possible from the sale. Chances are, as a real estate professional, you will be dealing with competing property values. The more unique the property, the more challenging it is to establish value. You may be able to give a seller a basic idea of the value of a home based on the factors that are publicly available to you. Only when a professional appraiser is hired will the seller have a firm understanding of the appraised value of their property. Real estate professionals must be aware of all factors impacting property value because they will have an impact on how you help sellers determine the price at which a property will be listed, as well as provide realistic information about how long a property will remain on the market before being sold.